This is A Different Perspective with Kevin Randle. A retired U.S. Lieutenant Colonel, Kevin Randle has been studying UFOs for nearly 50 years. Kevin has investigated some of the most famous UFO cases in the world and has been consulted for dozens of documentaries about UFOs. Considered one of the leading experts into the Roswell UFO crash of 1947, Kevin has written more than 25 books about UFOs, including the recently published Roswell in the 21st Century. Now, here is the host of A Different Perspective, Kevin Randle.
And welcome to this edition of A Different Perspective. I am, in fact, Kevin Randle. I was going to try to pretend like I was caught by surprise that we switched to me. One thing, I do not have a guest for today. I am flying solo, and this is all kind of inspired by Tucker Carlson, who apparently has reopened the cattle mutilation investigation things. And I'll get to that in just a moment. I did have a couple of other things I wanted to say before we got to the cattle mutilations. And one of the things that bothers me about the UFO community, and yes, I have notes down there, is that I'm sometimes astonished about the lack of thinking skills available in the UFO community. We can debate things amongst ourselves intelligently and rationally and try to go where the evidence goes. I think of abductions, and I've had some very interesting conversations with people dealing with alien abductions, and is this possible? And we talk about that. I look at both sides of the coins. I am interested in a couple of abductions. I think that the longitudinal studies that are claiming somebody's abducted year after year after year, month after month or whatever, I don't think that's really based in alien abductions. I think it's more terrestrially based and has other problems. But I think some of the one-offs, Barney and Betty Hill, I don't know. Travis Walton's becoming more and more shaky day by day, given things that are coming out about this. I think of Hickson and Parker, and some of the information coming out of that is becoming more solid. It's becoming more interesting. And I'll have more about that in later shows. And we've talked to Calvin Parker here a couple of times. But there are some things in the UFO community that we address periodically that I just don't think are relevant or factual. Think of the alien autopsy film. I think this has been thoroughly debunked. The guys who made the film have come out and said, we made the film. Here's how we did it. Here are photographs of us doing it so you can see how it progressed. And yet there are still people who will argue with you about the reality of the alien autopsy, saying, well, some of it's real. Ray Santilli, who's the one that announced this to the world, he says, well, a couple of the frames are real, but they can't point to which frames are real and how they got them and why we don't have the rest of the film and all of that kind of stuff. And I think, you've got to take a look at that. And I look at the people claiming time travel. They add really nothing to our knowledge of UFOs. They're clearly making the stuff up. And I'm thinking, if I'm a guy from the future, the first thing I'm going to do is buy a bunch of stocks to enhance my wealth when I get back to my home time. I'm going to say home planet, but my home time. There are stories such as Maury Island, which is clearly a hoax. And we keep having to repeat our investigations of that or our knowledge of that because somebody new comes along and they do a superficial investigation and look at some of the stuff and they say, oh, Maury Island is good. This was the guys who claimed that they saw 6 donut-shaped UFOs in early June 1947 prior to Arnold's sighting. And one of them was spewing some kind of debris and it injured the one fella's son and killed their dog and all this nonsense. And the investigation has been completed and is clearly a hoax. There's just nothing to it, and yet we have to re-evaluate that. And then, I'm getting tired of the charlatans that appear on the field all the time. And I don't really want to name any names, but I will say, the contactees of the 1950s are probably in that class. They provided no evidence. They told us things that clearly are not true. They based their information on the science from the 1950s. And I'm thinking, one of them was claiming that he had visited Venus, which was a tropical world, and hence all the clouds all the time, so you couldn't see it. We now know the surface temperature is something like 800 degrees Fahrenheit. And if you landed your ship on it, it'd probably melt. So clearly they were not telling us the truth. They talked about traveling to planets like Saturn, a big council on Saturn. And I'm thinking, where? Saturn is a gas giant. If there's a rocky core, it's very small. It's in the middle of the planet. And if you landed there, you'd be crushed by the gravitation. I think about, people say, well, you have to have an open mind. And I also think of the corollary to that, which is don't let your mind be so open your brain falls out. So when I look at things, I try to buy some documentation. I try to go by the evidence. And I just heard from a guy who was claiming he wanted all the tapes of the General Exxon interviews and the transcripts and all of that. And he queried QFOS about it. And Mark Rodecker, the scientific director of QFOS, said, well, we're not sending out those tapes. And so the guy wrote to me and he said, actually I invited him on this program and he declined. But he said to me, he was going to say that Exxon stuff was unverified because he didn't have the tapes. And I said, well, I have the tapes. Everything is verified. It's not anything that's made up. So you can say whatever you want, but you're going to look bad when it all comes out. And you look at some of the stories told by people, and I said I wouldn't name names, but Gerald Anderson, for example, there were small changes in his story, which didn't mean much, but there were major changes that did. And it's clear that his tale of seeing the crash saucer on the plains of San Augustine in 1948 has collapsed. And then there was Chris Montgomery, who I think appeared on this program and was calling me an Air Force shill. And I said, well, where'd you get that information? He wouldn't tell me. I know for a fact that I wasn't an Air Force shill. I did not share information to the Air Force about what I was doing. I was not spreading the Air Force word about UFOs. And I think you look at some of the things I've said about the Air Force, which makes it kind of funny because I was being investigated for a security clearance by the Air Force when I went into the Air Force intelligence. And they had copies of magazine articles where I was less than kind to the Air Force about their investigations. I still got the security clearances. So I look at all of that sort of thing. And I think that when we're looking at the UFO phenomena, we got to take all of that into consideration. We've got to think about all of that stuff simply because it is important to get to the proper sources, to understand what's going on. We've got to get rid of the ancillary nonsense that just sort of clutters the field and diverts our attention and wastes a great deal of our time. I don't have a great deal of faith in what's going to be happening here with the U.S. government getting back into the UFO business. But I will say this, the one thing that I can say about what's good about what they're doing now is it negates the Condon Committee. That was the Air Force's paid investigation at the University of Colorado in the 1960s. And they said, well, there's nothing to it. No national security implications. And the Air Force did a good job. And now we're in 2022 and they're saying, we got to look at this stuff. And I said, well, if they found nothing during the Colorado investigation, why are we looking at it now? I thought that answered everything about UFOs. So we can throw that out. So anyway, that kind of is my semi-rant about this. I just look at all the information that has been published, and so much of it has been inaccurate. And it's not necessarily the fault of the writers or the investigators. It's sometimes the witnesses, they seem credible. They seem like they know what they're talking about. They seem like they're good people. And you continue to look into the cases and you find that there's really nothing to it, that they've made up the story. There's something that breaks it down. And I remember what my good friend Brad Steiger used to say, that he would believe the story told by anybody in the beginning until he found a reason not to believe them anymore. He looked at it as not quite an investigation in the way that I did or Don Schmidt did or some of the people I've worked with do, but as people will tell you the truth. And that's kind of where Don and I stumbled in the beginning, is where we believed some of the things people were telling us about the Roswell case that turned out not to be true, and that diverted the attention. But his attitude was, I don't want to say lackadaisical, but kinder than mine. Mine was a little more hardcore, I suppose. Let's put it that way. And but that did not stop him from continuing to look at stuff and continuing to investigate. And he was very disappointed in Al Balick. He's a guy, one of the time travelers that I wasn't going to mention before. And Brad believed him. He said Balick had stayed at his house a number of times, and he was very disappointed when he found out that Balick wasn't telling him the truth. So You take a look at all of that sort of thing, and it becomes very distressing. And if you're a skeptic, it's very easy to break down some of the UFO phenomena because you can keep pointing to these hoaxes, and people will remember the hoaxes. They don't remember the good stuff. And they don't remember that many times the hoaxes are exposed by UFO investigators, or the solutions are provided by UFO investigators, and the skeptics were way off base on some of the things they said. So we've got to look at all of that when we look at that. And that kind of leads us into the cattle mutilation thing, because this was something that's been going on since the mid-1970s. I mean, in the public arena, it's allegedly going on before, and we'll get into that in a little bit later. But here was something that took over the UFO phenomenon for a period of time, not like abductions did, but for a number of years, the cattle mutilations was the big story in UFO investigation. And in fact, one UFO investigator had told a news station that every time we get a UFO sighting, we get a cattle mutilation, which of course isn't true, but that was what he said. So, I got started in the cattle mutilation investigation business when Jim Lorenzen, he was the international director of APRO, Aerial Phenomena Research Organization. I was one of the field investigators, and he called me one night. I was sitting at home minding my own business, and he called and was talking about these cattle mutilations that have been going on in Minnesota, and wondered if I could take a look into that. And I said, sure, I can do that. Minneapolis wasn't that far away. He gave me a couple of contacts up there. I called my friend Bob Cornett, and I've talked about him a couple times. He was on the show one time. He passed away this past April. So we prepared to go to Minneapolis to track down the sources he had given us, talk to some of the people and see what we can learn about the cattle mutilations going on in Minnesota. And that kind of got us involved in Minnesota. I'll have more about this on my blog at www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com. And I'll get a little more in depth here when we get back. So we'll be back right after this. So please stick around. And we are back. Or I am back, you should say. Excuse me for going off on a tangent there. Before I get more into the Minneapolis thing, I want to make one point that I didn't make before, and that was this whole thing, as I said at the beginning of the show, was inspired by Tucker Carlson, who did a cattle mutilation investigation. I didn't see the documentary he did because it's behind a paywall at Fox News, and I'm certainly not going to put any more money into their coffers if I can avoid it. I did see his interview about it. I've seen the promos for it, and some of the things he said there, I know that were not true. So that kind of inspired this, getting back into it. And I thought in the recent years that this whole thing was dead, and he's kind of brought it up. So as I was saying, I talked to Bob Cornett. We made plans to go to Minneapolis. We did not go up there unarmed because we had been warned that satanic worshipers were involved in it, and they some of their rituals got a little bit bloody and some of them a little bit deadly, and human sacrifice wasn't completely off the table, and there were the cults running around. So we were a little bit leery about that sort of thing. We found no evidence of that, by the way. But we did go up there with some weapons because through the old adage, it's better to have it and not need it, but to need it and not have it. So we kind of follow that dictum. So we went up there to the radio station. The news director there was a big help. He provided us some information. We were told that they knew that the UFOs were involved. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there. UFOs were involved because there had been an area where circles had been melted in the snow. And there was an area on a frozen lake where there were landing traces. And of course, there were the mutilated cattle. Well, we went out, we talked to the farmer, and he talked about the circles melted in the snow. And he said, yes, we used to have our silos there, but we moved them. And of course, some of the residue, some of the silage remain behind. And as that deteriorates, it creates heat. So you get these circles melted in the snow. No UFO landing site. What about the landing traces on the lake? Yes, the farmer had done that with an axe. He was trying to access the water to feed his livestock, or to water his livestock, I should say. So that didn't go very far. We checked with the local sheriff's office. There was no evidence of any satanic cults in the area. Sometimes you would find areas, abandoned houses, sometimes in, I want to say underpasses, you would see satanic symbols spray painted on, but there was never any evidence of big cult activity. So that was kind of a dead end there. We never found anything to suggest satanic cults were involved. I know that the news director had been very cautious about letting us know his real name. He had he was Michael Douglas. He used the name Michael Douglas on the air. And we eventually got into good graces with him, and he took us to his house and he was showing us around. And he had in his closet his uniform, old uniform, Army uniform, hanging there. And on it was the name tag. So we learned his real name by that. But nothing really came of that. So we were up there for a week. We didn't find any evidence of UFO activity. We didn't find any evidence of mutilated cows that couldn't be explained in the mundane. We talked to veterinarians. So we had all that information when we went up there. We couldn't verify any of it. So there was nothing more for us to do. And we came back and reported that to Jim Lorenzen, that we had not found any evidence of that. But in the meantime, I continued to investigate that. And what's interesting, in Colorado, there was a woman who worked at the newspaper in Colorado Springs. And somehow she got a hold of my name. And she would call me periodically to talk to me about cattle mutilations. And I would tell her what I knew. And the next thing I know, that information was appearing in the Colorado newspaper. And our local station was talking to her and reporting what she had written in the newspaper, which is what I had given her. So it was kind of an interesting thing. They made these long distance calls to her, but they didn't bother to call me with the questions that they had. So we really couldn't find any evidence that there was anything other than natural phenomena going on, is the best way to look at it. But we're not the only ones that found little in the way of mystery. There was a guy named Dane Edwards, who was the publisher of the Brush, Colorado Banner, which was a small newspaper, obviously in Colorado. And he said that he'd first heard about the mutilations back in 1963 when he lived in Texas. And he said that he was able to trace them back to 1961, but there wasn't much he could do with it given his job at the time, and he wasn't that interested in it anyway. So he'd kind of forgotten about it. He did look into a case briefly of 8 cows who had been killed along the Texas-Mexico border in 1969. But again, thought nothing of it because that looked like it was probably nothing to do with mutilations or mutilators, that sort of thing. So he continued to, he got interested in the phenomena. Sorry, I got trapped here in my own syntax. He got interested in it again when this all blew up in the national environment. So he began his investigation there. But what he did was he talked to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. I think the guy's name was Carl Whiteside. And what he learned based on his investigation and the Colorado Bureau of Investigation was that it was predators and scavengers who were attacking the carcasses of already dead animals. And that was why you were getting some of the mutilations. Yeah, the very parts of the animal that were attacked were the most vulnerable of parts, the soft tissues, the eyes, that sort of thing. And that's exactly where the scavengers would go as well. And Carl Whiteside of the CBI, Colorado Bureau of Investigation, released a report that said there had only been one mutilation in Colorado that he couldn't explain. So that kind of reduced the number of dead animals to basically one. But that wasn't confined to Colorado. There was a fellow named Craig Beck, or Beek, from the Iowa Bureau of Criminal Investigation. So it'd be the IBCI, which I thought was kind of a funny acronym. I don't know why. And he said that there hadn't been a single mutilation in Iowa. And this was at the height of the mutilation scare in the fall of 1975. And there had been a rumor that a satanic cult, we're back to the Satanists now, had used a gas grenade to kill 6 animals in the Dubuque, Iowa area. The vets confirmed that 6 animals were dead, but they said they hadn't been gassed. They died of a cattle-borne disease, I think they called it blackleg. So there was nothing there. The mutilations were there, but the cows had died of a natural causes. There was a guy named Roy Quebec. He was the assistant director of the Attorney General's Division of Criminal Investigations. And he said that 90% of the mutilations they had investigation, and I'm not sure what state he was from, happened to the animals after they had died, which I think is an important point. He was quick to point out that the mutilations he was talking about had been caused by scavengers and predators, that sort of thing. CBS News, in one point, had reported that they had found a mutilated animal, but near that animal's body was a blue plastic valise containing a cow's tongue, an ear, and a scalpel. And this was in Colorado, and they didn't know how it gotten there, but they believed it was dropped by the humans who were committing the mutilations rather than alien creatures. So we also got, back in Iowa, we've got more people talking about the mutilations. I ran into a bunch of guys that worked at a meatpacking house. It was, at one point, there was a number of meatpacking houses here in the Cedar Rapids, Iowa, Waterloo area. And I found talking to a number of butchers there. And they were telling me that they had found some cattle dead that in the area, and they had gone ahead and mutilated them as kind of a joke, because this is the height of the thing. And they said that they were just laughed at the claims that these were done by great surgical expertise and couldn't be easily duplicated. And they laughed at the veterinarian's claims. And I'm not sure what vets were making these claims, because I've never been able to find a vet who made those claims. It usually came back to somebody, some farmer or rancher saying that had found the animal but had no expertise in what that would look like. So I've now found no evidence of real mutilations. We know that the satanic gas grenade is not true. It was a mistake. We found butchers who have done the mutilations for the purpose of, I guess, having a good time. I don't know what the motivation was. Robert Lounsbury, who was the Iowa Secretary of Agriculture, claimed in 1977 that he might have been responsible for accidentally solving the problem. And he said that insurance companies might be the culprits in this. And what he meant by that was that most insurance policies on the animals did not cover natural causes for insurance purposes. If the cow died of natural causes, some kind of disease, it didn't count. Something else had to transpire. Mutilations would be one of those things. Or the cow was killed by lightning. I think there was one point where lightning is the responsibility for a number of cows found dead under an oak tree. They were killed by a lightning strike. But the point simply is, he thought that he had explained it because he mentioned the investigations that he had reviewed, and that the insurance might have been involved. And I have to agree with that, because I was on an investigation in Wisconsin in that era, of course, and I was talking to the local police, Grant County Police, and they pointed me to a vet in the area. His name was Jefferson Davis, which I always had to laugh at. Jefferson Davis is a good name for a Southerner, not some guy in Wisconsin. But the vet told me that he had investigated a cattle mutilation, and the farmer finally confessed that he had done it because the cow had died of natural cause. It had been sickly from birth. It wasn't insured for this. And he had cut off an ear and done some other things in an attempt to blame it on the mutilators. And so Lounsbury wasn't incorrect when he was saying that insurance might have been the responsible agency, responsible for some of the mutilations by doing that. The sheriff I talked to in Grant County, Wisconsin, was Percy Stitch, by the way, for those of you who like to have names associated with this, so we're not just throwing out stuff that we don't know. We'll get back with that, talking about what some of more of these people had to say, and we'll get into the Randle report, which I think is an important document in the investigation of cattle mutilations. And when we do, we'll learn a little bit more and find out why I am just not a big fan of cattle mutilation. Once again, I'll have some additional information. I'll have all this information up on my blog at www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com. And I will be back right after this, so please stick around. And I am back by myself, apparently, as they say in the business. When we went away, I was talking about solutions to all of this. And there's another solution that came up, factoring the cattle mutilations. And it's the hysteria about the possibility seems to stimulate additional claims of mutilation. And what I mean by there, people who had found an animal dead in their pastures or in their fields before wouldn't think much of it because it happens. Cattle die. They're struck by lightning. They get old. They collapse. They eat bad stuff. But with the hysteria going on in the cattle mutilation business now, they were looking at the animals differently, and they were looking at the damage done to the soft tissues. They were looking at what looked like surgical precision and that sort of thing. And now suddenly the death was caused by some kind of mutilators, even though the ranchers, and I don't mean any disrespect, but they were not competent to suggest that the animal had been mutilated by somebody using surgical precision or lasers or that sort of thing. There was a old magazine, a defunct, called The Zetetic, which I guess evolved into the Skeptical Inquirer. And a sociologist, Dr. James R. Stewart, had studied groups of mutilation reports, one from Nebraska and another from South Dakota in 1974. And what he discovered, or what he did in an article he called The Collective Delusion and Comparison of Believers and Skeptic. And he was suggesting that the mutilations began as an expression of concern for problems outside the rancher's ability to solve. The prices of feed, the price at the livestock shows when you sold your cattle off, the prices of everything else that they had to deal with, the expense of running a farm and that sort of thing. And when that stuff went up, they tend to look at outside forces, and the mutilation thing seemed to be an outside force that they could kind of grasp and go on. And he noted something that was very interesting. He said that the mutilations didn't seem to affect dairy herds. And you think about what we're talking about is beef cattle, basically, and the dairy herds weren't having the similar problems. And he said that was because the dairy farmers weren't concerned about these outside influences because they were government subsidies that took care of all of that for them. So they didn't have to worry about that. So he also showed there was a positive correlation between the number of incidents reported in a prescribed area and the number of news inches devoted to livestock mutilations by the media. So there's a correlation there between getting the reports and how much attention the media is devoting to this sort of thing. And I noticed the same thing in UFO sightings. You'll find what they call flaps, areas of intense activity in localized areas, as opposed to a wave that affected a very, very long area. What I determined there was the reason you suddenly got an influx of reports in a localized area is the news media would talk about a UFO sighting of some kind, and people hearing that would realize there's a reporting point for their UFO sightings. Back in the 50s and 60s, of course, it was the Air Force, and they knew that. And so you would get this a localized flap area because of the interest, and they knew where to report it. They didn't know where to report it. They didn't know others had seen it, then they were reluctant to report it themselves. And so it's sort of the same thing that he said. And what Stewart also wrote, and I think it's important, in a quote here, so I'm going to read this. He said, local law enforcement personnel have little, if any, experiences in determining the causes of death of cattle. Consequently, they were inclined to adopt the farmer's explanations in the absence of any solid refuting evidence of their own. This same was true of some local veterinarians. Rarely do they examine dead cattle. Instead, they are usually asked to treat living animals. So what their pronouncements were about the precision of the incisions and that sort of thing. There's another incident that took place that kind of reflects on this, and this took place in 1954 in actually Seattle, Washington area. There had been a series of tests. This was back when they were doing above ground testing. There were various ground testing being conducted in the Pacific Ocean. And some people in a small town north of Seattle, I believe it was, noticed that there was pitting in their windshields. And they thought it was due to the radioactive fallout. And this was reported in the news media. And then more people began reporting it until it culminated in a 2-day period where there were 3,000 reports of damage to windshields in the Seattle area. What they determined was the pitting was actually what you would expect from use of your car on the road. You know, you get the little rocks bouncing up on off the asphalt or things like that, make little tiny pits in the windshield. And they wouldn't notice those because you don't look at the windshield, you look through it. And now they're out looking at their windshield and they said, oh my gosh, it happened to me too. But there was nothing that related it to the atomic testing. There was nothing to suggest there was anything abnormal going on. So the governments, various state governments, especially New Mexico, trying to determine what exactly was going on, contacted an ex-FBI agent, Ken Rommel, and he was commissioned to make an independent study of what was going on. He was located in New Mexico. I corresponded with the guy back in the 1970s, and he was kind enough to FedEx me his lengthy report, which ran to 297 pages, I should say. At one point that he made that I'd heard either in the promo for Carlson's documentary or in the interview with him was that the term of surgical precision, as I said, these people weren't qualified to make those determinations. What he said, and I'm going to quote from him, this is his words, not mine, Sheriff Numbnuts, saying it looks like laser surgery. He said reporters love to quote that because it sounds good, but nobody ever asked the sheriff, well, how do you know it was an experience of laser surgery? How did you know about that? So in keeping with those thoughts from Rommel, I noticed that one of the comments made back then and repeated today is that this mutilation phenomenon goes back hundreds of years. And I thought, I don't know, I can't find anything about that. It goes back to actually 1606 when a group of sheep were found slaughtered north of London, and nothing was taken but the tallow and some inert parts of the carcasses remained, the fleece remained. They didn't take any of the other stuff. And where's this quote come from? And I was able to trace it back to, and there's I think a report on my blog, Chasing Footnotes, where I talk about how I got to this. But I communicated with a friend of mine, Chris O'Brien, who has written 3 books on cattle mutilations. He's going to be on the program at the end of the month, and he's going to refute what I'm saying here today about that. And what we learned there, I found documentation when he pointed me to the right place. I found documentation from a book published in 1848, I think it was, which was based on the papers from the king from that time, 1606 time back in England. And the report is in there and says basically that, but it's not just around the London area. There's a number of other reports like that. But we also found that the tallow was used in candles. And so I'm just wondering if that had something to do with that as well. There was a interesting study done by the Washington County, Arkansas Sheriff Herb Marshall in 1979. And they had come across a recently deceased cow, a dead cow, and they put it under observation for 2 full days. I mean, they stood there, they sat there, they watched it. I think they filmed parts of this for 2 days, 48 hours. And over that time, bacteria caused the skin to tear. The expanding gases caused the stomach to split. they saw blowflies lay eggs in the soft tissues, the eyes, the lips, the anuses, the very portions of the cows that are always mutilated. And the maggots that would hatch in as little as 10 hours could clean the soft tissues to the bone. So the things that were being reported by the sheriffs or by the ranchers were natural phenomena that they were witnessing the whole time. And I think it's important to remember they watched the cow for 2 days and it ended up looking like these mutilated cows. And these observations were duplicated in Alberta, Canada in 1989, when researchers there published the results of their investigation, and they concluded, and I'll quote here, the parts reported missing from mutilated cattle are the same as those known to be removed by scavengers, primarily coyotes and birds, in early stages of scavenging a carcass. So they found basically the same thing that the sheriff had found. And I want to say one thing. One of the pictures that Carlson used on his promo for his book, his documentary, was of a cow laying in the field, and there's a New Mexico state trooper, and I think it's Gabe Valdez is who it is, I think. And he says there were no footprints of predators around this animal, in the soft dirt around the animal, no footprints to suggest predation. But if you look at the carcass, there's bird droppings all over it. Birds also scavenge, and they would go for the soft parts. They were even talking at one point where there were upside mutilations, and you turn the animal over, and there weren't the similar mutilations on the underside, suggesting it was the parts that the birds could get to. So I think that when we look at all of that and this promo, that we can pretty well determine that the majority of the cows' deaths, all of them, are probably the result of natural phenomena, not aliens coming from space to mutilate the cows. There's one other point I'm going to make, and I'll make it here in just a few minutes. I mean, I think it's another important point because it was a challenge issued to me about the lack of copper in the blood of the animals when the necropsy was performed. And I think that's an important point because I said, how do you explain the lack of copper in the bloods? And I'll explain exactly how I did that in just a moment here. Once again, I'll have other documentation at my blog at www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com, and I will be back right after this. And I'm back, and I'm not surprised at being back here. I knew there was one segment left. And I apologize for keep looking down, but I do have notes. I think it's important so I can remember the names and I can keep everything straight. I mentioned Ken Rommel and his report. And I think what's important here, well, let me backtrack here. I mentioned just before we went to the break, and that's the point I wanted to make first, and I'll get back to Ken Rommel. It may have been Chris O'Brien, maybe somebody else. It said, well, how do you explain the lack of copper in the blood of the animals? And I thought, well, there's a darn good question. How do I explain that? 25 years ago, I probably wouldn't have been able to find the answer. But in today's environment, actually, I did this about 10 years ago. I went on the internet and I said, copper deficiency in cattle. And I cannot believe the number of scientific reports that came up. Well, that right there tells me that there's a scientific explanation for the lack of copper in cattle. And so I really didn't have to go any further if I didn't want to. I had now explained that this is a natural phenomenon. But I looked at some of the reports and I discovered, I think it's in Utah, for example, the vegetation that the cattle snack on, the cattle eat. The environment doesn't provide enough copper for the animals, and there are copper supplements that the ranchers provide for them. If a cow is recently given birth, there's going to be a lack of copper in the blood of the animal. Any number of reasons for there being a lack of copper in the animal. So I'm not sure when this point was first made, and I'm assuming it's going to be in the late 1970s, early 1980s, long before we had the internet for us to use as a tool, because I would have never been looking through veterinarian journals to look for these articles. I was going to say I wouldn't know where to go, but I do know where to go. I'd gone to the University of Iowa and looked down at the libraries down there for that. But I could do it sitting home and pull up these articles and answer that sort of question. So that's kind of where I am on that. You know, there really is nothing abnormal, alien, satanic about the death of the animals. And one of the points I should make before I get to Ken Rommel is Carlson mentioned in his report that 10,000 animals had been killed. That was a number that I think Tom Adams came up with in the 1980s. And if that's true, then nothing has died since then in this fashion. So the number is just one that was thrown out there and everybody seized on it and reported it without going any deeper. I have found other articles that suggest, you know, like 8,000 were in Colorado and other numbers, so we could have raised it higher. But one of the criticisms of Rommel was he was a government employee, which I don't think is relevant there. I don't think he would have compromised his integrity. He was there to find out what happened. And those who didn't like his conclusions then began to attack the man as opposed to the source of the information. They said that during his investigation, he didn't see a classic mutilation, which means during his investigation, not one cow had been mutilated the classic fashion in New Mexico. What are the odds of that? It's been going on since the 1960s at least. Why hadn't he seen a classic mutilation? I also read where he didn't personally inspect any dead animal, but sat upwind in the car while somebody else took the pictures and did the investigation. And I'm not sure why that's relevant either. I mean, the man was out there at the site. And going to the site, I think sometimes is very important and sometimes it's kind of irrelevant, but he was out there. He didn't have to inspect the dead animal. He had experts who would do that. And if you look at his report, he lists quite a few veterinarian organizations that he contacted as he was doing his investigation. And what he said in his report is now, of course, backed up by what the Arkansas police officers saw in their observation and what the Canadians found in their investigations. So we've got additional conclusions drawn by experts who are looking into this and finding that the observations, while there may look like surgical precision on the animals, it's something that is natural. It happens naturally. The expanding gases in the animal causes the splits to look like it's surgical precision. The insects and the predators get to it. There's another book that I think is important for all of those who are interested in understanding cattle mutilations. And I probably should mention Chris O'Brien's books on the other side of the coin, but we'll have him on the show and he can do that. One of the books that I used was Stalking the Herd by Chris O'Brien. So that gives you the list of it. Was a book by Daniel Kagan and Ian Summers. And they did a book. They were commissioned by Bantam, I believe, given $100,000 to investigate cattle mutilations. And so they spent a great deal of time traveling the West, talking to an awful lot of people about the cattle mutilations and things like that. They even ran into Carl Flock. And for those of you who don't know, Carl Flock became an anti-Roswell investigator, determined it was a balloon, that sort of thing. When he was introduced to Summers and Kagan, he said his name was Kurt Peters, Kurt with a K. And he always say, he's Carl with a K. So it's clearly the same guy. They do a thing in their book, which is kind of funny. They say, hickory dickory dock, we know you're Carl Flock. And Flock and another guy was working on a book about cattle mutilations, and Flock and this other guy saw them as competitors. But I think it's important that you take a look at Mute Evidence. It's a well-researched book. It's very in-depth, and I think it's kind of a classic on eliminating the idea that it's something unusual going on. Their book, as I said, is Mute Evidence. Chris O'Brien did Stalking the Herd, and he's got a couple of other books about that. You can look it up. Linda Moulton Howe did some reports on this, which I think were well publicized. And Tom Adams ran an investigation into cattle mutilations, and I guess was not a fan of my investigation from some of the things I've heard. But I will say, based on my research, based on the people I talked to, based on really not finding anything that was suggestive of alien intervention. And I have to wonder, what would be the point of mutilating literally thousands of cows? You're an alien race is cow anus some kind of a delicacy on Zeta 2 reticuli? I mean, what is the deal with that? I mean, that's the soft tissues you'd expect. But it makes no sense. Why not just take the DNA from several cows and in a jar, small jar, take it back to your home planet and grow your own cattle, and have to stop the travel of interstellar distances to mutilate the cows. I mean, it makes no logical sense. And if you've mutilated one cow, if you're an alien looking at studying a animal on Earth, do you need to mutilate 10,000 of them, or 10, 12,000, or whatever the number is? You pretty well can get it done in 4 or 5. Set a baseline and you pretty well understand what's going on. So my investigation and working with Bob Cornett, as I say, and talking to people in Minnesota, talking to people in Wisconsin, talking to people in Illinois and Missouri and Colorado. Somehow I skipped Nebraska and Wyoming. I found no evidence that cattle mutilation was anything unusual. I will tell one story, though. When this was all going on, and I was part of the Iowa National Guard, there's a lot of rustling going on as well. And we were flying helicopters, and the idea was the rustlers were using helicopters to rustle the cattle. And we were flying along one day at 1,500 feet or whatever we were in formation, practicing our formation flying. And one of the aircraft says, "Yeah, got to tell you guys something strange. We're taking fire." And there was some farmer down there with a shotgun shooting at us. And I said, "Well, we should return fire for fire received," which was part of the rules of engagement in Vietnam. Oh, but we didn't have any weapons with us. And besides, the shotgun's going to not reach to 1,500 feet. So I don't know what I was doing. Anyway, that is kind of my analysis, brief though it might be, on cattle mutilations. And I will give, I say, Chris O'Brien. And he's a good guy. I've talked to him a number of times. And when I was looking for the quotes from Stalking the Herd, I didn't have a copy of that book in my library, but I had a number of others. He sent me a copy of it electronically so I could look the stuff up myself, and it provided the answers that I wanted. So he's a good guy, and I think we'll have an interesting discussion. I will warn you that I probably will not press him very hard on this sort of thing, because I understand where he's coming from, and he's been working with the sheriffs out in Colorado. He lives out in that area and has done an awful lot of research. But I'll ask him the germane questions about this, and we'll just see if we can come to some kind of a conclusion. But that'll be coming up, if I can read my calendar right, which is not to say I can, on September 28th. Next week, I'll be talking to Tom Carey. We're going to look at his investigation at Roswell a little bit more in depth. I'm going to ask him about his impressions of Glenn Dennis in today's world, given what we know about him, some of the things about the sad things that we've learned about Jesse Marcel, which are disturbing in a sense. And I don't know exactly how to phrase this. I respect him from being in World War II and being a military officer serving in the Pacific during the Second World War. But some of the things that he's told us, some of the things that he said about his experiences in Roswell, I think are exaggerated, to be kind about it. Some embellishments on that, and we'll talk a little bit about that, and then we'll talk about Tom's career, what he found in his investigation of other UFO sightings, what he's feeling on some of the other aspects of UFOs. He warned me he's not interested in abductions or cattle mutilations or any of this stuff, but I'm going to ask him about that simply because I think it's interesting to find out why he's not interested. It may be because there's no physical evidence to really look at, or it's just something that wasn't interesting to him. Although Tom, I think, has a master's degree in physical anthropology, so that kind of investigation I would think would intrigue him. But we'll find that out next week when we talk to Tom. As I say always, I'll have a little bit more about this and the names and everything on my blog at www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com. If you want to get ahead of the conversation on Roswell, take a look at Understanding Roswell, which is my latest book on Roswell. I think you'll find that interesting. And of course, take a look at Leveland, because I think that's a very interesting case that should be researched in depth. There should have been researched in depth. So I will return in 167 hours with Tom Carey talking about UFOs and that sort of thing. So thanks for tuning in.